All Hit Radio.
Welcome to the X Zone, a place where fact is fiction and fiction is reality. Now, here's your host, Rob McConnell.
Welcome back, everyone. This is the X Zone. I am Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, and around the world on the X Zone Broadcast Network and our fine family of broadcast affiliates, satellite provider, programming providers, right around the world. Worldwide, toll-free, 1-800-610-7035. My email address is xzone@xzoneradiotv.com. On all social media sites, X Zone Radio TV. And our main website where you can listen to the X Zone 24/7, 365, www.xzoneradiotv.com. X Zone Nation, we're going to be talking about the Ebola epidemic, and we're going to ask our guest a question. Is the Ebola a curse from God? Well, our guest this hour is Jay Milbrandt. He has many months of boots-on-the-ground experience in Africa as a human rights lawyer and former head director of Global Justice Program at Pepperdine University. While in Africa, Jay also conducted hundreds of hours of research for his new book on Dr. David Livingstone, one of the first explorers to bring modern science and medicine to Africa during his quest for the source of the Nile. Driven by his deeply held Christian belief, Livingstone was also very instrumental in ending the slave trade in Africa. Now, for more information on our guest this hour, www.jmilbrandt.com. He also has a Facebook page at facebook.com/jmilbrandt, and you can follow him on Twitter at jmilbrandt. And Jay, welcome to the X Zone. Great having you here with us.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks for having me tonight.
Jay, I don't think there's a person on earth who hasn't heard about the Ebola outbreak in Africa. Mind you, two of the three countries now have been Ebola-free for more than 42 days. Is the Ebola a curse from God?
Well, we certainly have had people who believe so.
Mm-hmm.
This summer we had a group of Christian leaders who gathered in Liberia to declare that God is angry with Liberia. And it hasn't just been Christians. We also had a Muslim cleric who called it God's punishment, that God was angry about corruption and immorality. Well, now, I'm not a theologian, I'm not a scientist,
Mm-hmm.
but I do know there are some practical concerns with this, especially where theodicy is trumping public health.
So, what was it like in Africa when you were there?
Well, I've been there several times. You know, there's definitely variations to Africa. There is the village level, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of this crisis is taking place at the village level, and that's you have information that's sporadic. You have a very spiritual environment where witch doctors and various different groups can play very influential roles in the area, and then you have very modern Africa that feels a lot like America and parts of Europe. So it's diverse.
Wow. Tell us the inspiration for writing your book, The Daring Heart of David Livingstone, Exile, African Slavery, and the Publicity Stunt That Saved Millions.
Well, Dr. Livingstone is a name that many of us recognize.
Mm-hmm.
We know that phrase, Dr. Livingstone, I presume.
Right.
It's just part of culture. And
It is.
that was this famous meeting where American journalists found Dr. Livingstone was lost in remote Africa. And I knew this little nugget of history, and I was actually in Africa. I went over and climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and
Wow.
wanted to read a book about the original explorations of Africa, because it felt so similar to what I imagined it to be like. And so I knew the Livingstone name, looked for a biography on him, and saw this nugget about the slave trade being important to him, that he wanted to end it. And so I wanted to read more about that specifically. And went out to look for a book on that and couldn't find it, but found that Livingstone was very passionate about it. And history is focused on Stanley trying to find Livingstone, but they don't ask the question of why. Why was Livingstone lost in Africa? And the answer is that he was there trying to find it, trying to end the slave trade. And to me, that was the real story.
That is a big story, and that's a story that still lives today with the slave trade, not only in Africa, but in other parts of the world as well. Stand by, Jay. You and I have to take a commercial break. We'll be back in 2 minutes. X-Zone Nation, our guest this hour is Jay Milbrandt. He's the author of The Daring Heart of David Livingstone, Exile, African Slavery, and Publicity Stunt That Saved Millions. And the book is available at Amazon.com. For more information on Jay, his website is jmilbrandt.com. He's on Facebook at facebook.com/Jay Milbrandt, and you can follow Jay on Twitter at Jay Milbrandt. This is the X-Zone. I am Rob McConnell, and I'll be back on the other side of this commercial break as we continue this hour talking about, well, everything from David Livingstone to the darkest areas of Africa. Here, this hour in the X-Zone. Don't go away. Welcome back, everyone. Jay Milbrandt is our guest. He is the author of The Daring Heart of David Livingstone, Exile, African Slavery, and the Publicity Stunt That Saved Millions. It's available on Amazon.com. And CDC Director Thomas Frieden said last week that the Ebola outbreak is the biggest world health crisis since HIV/AIDS, while U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services Sylvia Burwell said, "The nation is frightened, and people are frightened of this disease." That fear has reached a fever pitch in West Africa. At a recent meeting in Liberia, more than 100 Christian leaders, the country is roughly about 85% Christian, declared that God was angry and the deadly Ebola outbreak is a plague. They called for prayers to seek God's forgiveness for sins including corruption and immoral acts such as homosexuality. In outlying tribal communities, the spread of Ebola is leaving hundreds of children orphaned, and a number of them are reportedly marginalized due to the fear of witchcraft and black magic. There's a strong belief in witchcraft that Ebola is contracted through a curse, or in some cases, that is a white man's fabrication, said Jamie Bedson, charity Restless Development Sierra Leone's country director, according to the Financial Times. So, a curse, witchcraft, religion, or just a virus that has gone wild, rampant because of the living conditions. My guest this hour is Jay Milbrandt. And Jay, in your opinion, what is the reason for Ebola? You've been over there many times. I don't believe it's a curse. I don't believe it's a plague. I don't believe it's witchcraft. In my humble opinion, and I'm no expert, I would say that the poor living conditions have a lot to do with it.
Well, I think you're right. I'm not a theologian or a scientist. I can tell you that at the village level, it's certainly things are very different. And when we talk about these issues with the religious leaders speaking up about it, with witchcraft, the concern is that there's misinformation. There's a lot of misinformation being shared when you have religious leaders who recommend 3 days of fasting and prayer was one of the recommendations. And that's a fine recommendation. It's a great recommendation to the nation. But where the concern is that when people hear that, they interpret that as that's the solution. That's what I have to do, and I'm immune from it. That's the information gap, and there's a lot of this misinformation is what's continuing to allow the virus to spread.
Jay, why are there certain parts of Africa that are so poor, that apparently, from what I can see, are being neglected by humanity? Why is this happening?
Well, one reason is that it's very remote. It's hard to get to. They're not easy to operate in, and even these villages have turned away some of the healthcare workers, which, not surprising when you come in these suits that sort of look like, you're from a different planet,
right.
and you're going in and telling them that there's this crisis, and they don't believe it. They don't really trust you. They're being told different things by their village leaders, and so it's a different world, and they want to, in some ways, and they want to explain what's happening, and it's very spiritual, and so looking toward witch doctors and religious leaders who are prominent at the village level, and are often controlling the discussion and controlling the information on public health.
It seems that these villages are somewhat back into the early ages of the development of society. And is one of the problems, Jay, that we're trying to communicate with these villagers and talk to them in a language that is just way beyond their sociological standing at the time?
Well, I think in part. I mean, I think they certainly are extremely intelligent, but they don't grow up in schools that have microscopes,
right?
And I think we take it for granted the sort of understanding of the world that we have just from the way we're educated, the access we have to things like microscopes. So being able to realize there are things, viruses that we can't see that are being transmitted person to person, and it's even hard, I think, for us, those who have been educated in this thing, to wrap our head around it. That's certainly why we're having panic in North America, and it's even harder at the village level where this hasn't really been understood or explained.
Let's talk about your book, Dr. Livingstone, Slavery. As I understand it, slavery is on the increase, not only from African countries. In fact, look at the girls that were taken. Look what ISIS is doing in northern Africa and the Middle East, but also other parts of the world. So tell me about Dr. Livingstone and his fight for freeing slavery, and what's the word that you used in your title? The publicity stunt that saved millions.
Mm-hmm. Well, we certainly are seeing a new world of slavery in some ways. Livingstone was in a different era of it. I mean, he saw the end of the transatlantic slave trade, where America and Britain were shipping slaves across the Atlantic to work in cotton fields and sugarcane fields. And then what he experienced there is it shifted to something that looks a little bit more like what we see today, but a slavery that moved to the east coast of Africa, where the slaves were taken up through the Arab Peninsula, and Europe wasn't involved, and America wasn't involved, and he saw this and wanted to bring an end to it. He saw this as being one of the most important humanitarian and public crises of his day. And for Livingstone, it was, how do we enforce justice? They had, in some cases, even good law in place, maritime law that would prevent the transport of slaves, but no one was enforcing it. And how do you get the British government or the American government, foreign governments who have no direct involvement in this slavery trade, how do you get them to act? How do you get them to intervene? And this is a question that we have today, not just in slavery, and certainly we have that. Right now, it's sort of the epicenter of a lot of human trafficking is in Southeast Asia. We're seeing growth in Arab peninsulas and places, and we don't, Western countries like the United States and Canada, Britain, we don't have involvement in it. Should we be involved is the question. Should we intervene? Should we intervene in Syria? Should we intervene in these different places that where we haven't caused the humanitarian crisis?
What's your opinion? Should we?
Well, I think, Livingstone, I think, would argue, and he certainly did argue in terms of slavery, that it was necessary. And I think one of the distinctions is that he aptly believed that the British government could bring about the end of the slave trade. They could blockade the ports and bring it about. I think if at Livingstone here, he would say, if we have the ability to do it, and he was a doctor, he would say the anecdote, if we have the anecdote to solve this, we should intervene. I think the question for us is whether we have the anecdote. And, certainly what we've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan maybe leaves that to question that we can certainly intervene and do things, but whether we can actually solve it is another matter.
But isn't that what the United Nations is for?
Well, the United Nations, that was its intent initially. It was set up to solve disputes between nations, and in some ways it's changed a lot. You'll see the United Nations doing peacekeeping missions within countries. They're often just solving internal disputes today, and the United Nations is really broken as far as these solving global crises. And you have countries who don't want to send their forces to be part of the United Nations peacekeeping, and it's even hard to manage. It'd certainly be wonderful to think that it could happen, but it doesn't seem like that system, which was intended for that purpose, was able to work. And so you come back to having individual countries who have to decide if they want to intervene or work together as a coalition.
If the United Nations isn't working, why do we keep it around?
Well, it certainly has a legacy and an institution. I think that there are people who question that, question whether it's still valuable, and there's some debate about whether it should even be in the United States, because the United States isn't. We're not as interested in what the United Nations is doing like we used to be.
Right.
Is it still relevant? It's not as relevant as it once was, and there may be. I think if we see major countries end up pulling out of it, it could fade. But I think it does serve a purpose in that it gathers people together. There's some discussion, and the annual meetings that they have are still an important gathering. And if nothing else, it serves that place for discussion and commentary.
Should it be revamped? Modernized?
Probably. Yeah. Probably, but it's not clear what that would even look like. I mean, with the Security Council, for instance, it's even hard to get action because the veto power of certain countries is very powerful, and you want to intervene, but you have these alignments and interests. I think the big question would be who would revamp it, because you have a lot of nations who would love to have the power of that and the ability to override and unilaterally make decisions.
I guess.
I think you're going to have you see trouble just with the United Nations agreeing on things in the current structure. To redo the entire structure would be a very challenging task.
All right, Jay, please stand by. You and I have to take our news break at the bottom of the hour. Exonation Jay Milbrandt is our guest. He's the author of The Daring Heart of David Livingstone, Exile, African Slavery, and the Publicity Stunt That Saved Millions. And we'll be back on the other side of this commercial break with the news as we continue here in the X Zone with yours truly, Rob McConnell, from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't go away.
I'm Rob McConnell, and welcome to the X Zone, a place where people dare to believe and dare to be heard. Today on the X Zone, contacting the dead by phone. Can you contact the dead by phone? Thomas Edison kept his machine secret until they were patented, so little is known about what he may have planned but never completed. However, in 1941, a blueprint was found in New York for a telephone to contact the dead, and this was allegedly to have been Edison's plan. It may have well been a fraud. However, in any case, a model was made from the design, but unfortunately, it didn't work. Contacting the dead, fact or fiction, the quest continues in the X Zone.
Welcome back, everyone. Jay Milbrandt is our guest this hour, and Jay is the author of The Daring Heart of David Livingstone, Exile, African Slavery, and the Publicity Stunt That Saved Millions. For some reason, I want to keep saying, Jay, The Daring Heart of Dr. David Livingstone, but that's not the title, so I apologize for that. Jay's website, www.jmilbrandt.com. You can follow Jay on Facebook, facebook.com/Jay Milbrandt, and follow him on Twitter at Jay Milbrandt. What was the publicity stunt that saved millions?
Well, I'm glad you asked. It's a great question. Livingstone, we know the name from history. We know that he was an explorer.
Mm-hmm.
Some of us know that he's a missionary, and we have him connected as an explorer roughly to the Nile River, that he had something to do with the Nile. And Livingstone had made several expeditions to become a hero, and then he did an expedition where he completely failed. Things fell apart, and he really had a falling from grace. He was trying to decide what to do next with his life. Well, there was a great geographic question that had been wondered for centuries by philosophers and geographers. Where did the Nile River begin? And people believe that it were great fountains. There were all these theories. So Livingstone decided, well, he wanted to speak up about the slave trade, but no one would listen to him anymore because he had lost his heroic status, and he was sort of discarded in some ways. And so he decided if he could go back to Africa and discover the sources of the Nile, to make that determination, to answer the most pressing geographic riddle in history, that he would come back to Europe as the expert, the hero for Africa, and he would be able to speak about the slave trade, and people would listen and take his advice and his admonition to end it. And so, his quest for the Nile, many historians have painted him as an explorer who wanted to find the source of the Nile for his own self-purpose and to build a reputation, and that's false. He wanted to do it to end the slave trade. It was a publicity stunt to be able to speak to the world about this awful evil that he was seeing.
Did it work?
Well, that's part of the story that people have to read, and ultimately, even today, he was partially right on some of his theories. He never found it, though.
No way.
He never answered the riddle. He actually passed away in the jungle before he could get there, before he could reach what he thought was the Nile. And coincidentally, even today, we have geographers who still argue about where the source is, and they keep extending the source of the Nile. And they keep debating whether it's the Amazon or the Nile that's the longest river in the world, and by inches and feet, they go back and forth between those two titles. But Livingstone never found it. He passed away, and but his letters that he was writing, his admonitions to the world, made it out, and he never knew it, but his letters were published the world over and ended up making the difference that brought about the end of the slave trade. And 36 days after his death, slavery was legally ended throughout Africa. And it was a legacy he would never know. He died believing he was a failure, but yet accomplished so much and ended this horrific tragedy, and a part of his legacy he would never see.
During the research of your book, were there any Any findings that you made that just blew you away?
Well, there were so many things, and I think for me it was going through a lot of these newspapers and old journals that people have rarely seen, and biographers have painted him in the last few decades in a very negative light. And so that was even the approach when I wrote this. I thought I was going to be very critical of him, and I tried to be judicious. But I came out admiring him, and you see in his personal letters, you see a lot of a different story. And his journals and things are published and edited by people, by himself and by other people, but you kind of get to the truth in a lot of his journals. And so the publicity stunt was one of those things, because I thought the Nile was, and even through most of my research, I felt like it was, him trying to regain that heroic position he once held. But then I came across these letters where he was writing to friends, where he was admitting that the real purposes were for ending the slave trade. And I think you get to the truth of what he intended. Some of the other things that were interesting is that there's actually continued research on Livingstone and his letters. He would, when he was lost in the jungle, he ran out of writing material, so he would make inks out of nuts, things that he could grind up, and he would write, and then those letters would fade or wash off if they got wet, and so he would just reuse the same piece of paper. And so scientists are doing spectral imaging, X-ray imaging on his letters and finding several different layers of letters that are invisible, that are written by him on the same piece of paper. And so there are continued things that are coming out that we learn about him and learn about his intentions.
How many people were actually brought over from Africa as slaves?
Well, hundreds of thousands. We don't know a total number, and we make some estimates, and in this book I tried to follow what were the rough estimates of the slave trade, and it was Livingstone and his colleagues estimated that at the height of this is just the East African trade. There was a trade that had hundreds of thousands and perhaps millions that came out of West Africa, the transatlantic trade. But they estimated at least more than 600,000 had been, and now that's just who came, who was sold through the slave markets and were counted. Livingstone estimated that there were 2 to 3 times as many who never made it to the coast, because he would just watch as these slave traders, they were so brutal that if someone was, and people were so plentiful as a resource, that if somebody was lagging behind, it was easier on the slave traders to just kill them there than to take them out and sell them, because they could just acquire someone else along the way. And so it became an incredibly brutal trade, in part because they had to walk for months across Africa to get to the coast. And so no one knows, no one ever will know how many victims there were of it, but we certainly have, if we were to make rough estimates of the number that passed away, then we're probably in the millions.
My good Lord. I often wonder what kind of people would actually hire or buy these people. How does one person buy another person and make them into a slave? It just...
I can't comprehend it either. Certainly it became, for whatever reason, it became a culturally okay practice in certain groups. And I think as a culture, people just had to decide, we're going to turn away from this and look. And why people determined to do that initially, it's impossible to say. But certainly, the traders and the people who were buying and selling did horrific things that seem almost inhuman, and you wonder how that could even be. But we continue to see it today, and I've met even modern day slave owners and slaves, and in places like Burma and Thailand, and it still happens. And there are people who still sell their children into this, and you wonder how it's possible, but it happens. What it takes for people to separate themselves from their humanity is incomprehensible.
It is. It truly is. And to think that it even goes on today, it makes, once again, I just can't understand it. How can society as a whole allow this to keep happening? Is it because there is no enforcement?
That's my interpretation. I mean, in many countries, most countries across the world, we have great laws in place. Easy for legislators to write good laws.
Yeah.
It's hard to get police to enforce it. And I think that there's this system that sort of gets out of control, where you don't have you have police who become corrupt. They're not paid enough, so they start taking bribes, and then these practices get encouraged. There are predators and pedophiles and people who are out there who will want to try to buy services. And so you bribe a police officer who bribes somebody else. Eventually the system gets out of control and it's just lawless. And so my sense in being in a lot of these places is that the problem comes down to that there's not a justice system. There's no mechanism for enforcing law, even though we can sort of legislate this, it spirals out of control and it takes a while to rein it in.
Something I've never understood, maybe you can help me understand this as being a person who is involved in the enforcement of laws and the protection of people. Why is it that the armies of the world cannot be brought in as peace officers to help fight many of these problems that current law enforcement just do not have the resources to?
Well, that's a great point. It's hard to say on a country-by-country level how they want to use them, and we have seen that in certain places. And Mexico has tried to do that, and I think in part effectively. There are certainly some places along the California border where it's gotten better, where the police, at the police level, they couldn't handle the situation.
Right.
They brought in a highly trained force that doesn't have the layers of corruption that local police can have. Now, in a lot of these countries, look at a place like Cambodia. They're not really large enough countries that there's a huge standing army, and whether they can be free from corruption and things like police force are not always clear, whether they even have the resources to do it. But it seems like there may be better positioned in some cases to enforce some of these things than the local police are, which are often corrupted.
Another example that I'd like to bring to light is the current crisis between the southern U.S. border and Mexico. The thousands of people that are crossing because, I'm not talking crossing legally, by the way, the people who are crossing illegally, because they know that the resources of law enforcement in that area are strained. So if we've got members of the military that are available, members of the Marines, the Army, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, whoever, why can't we just use them to supplement law enforcement?
Well, I don't have a whole lot of experience down there. I've been down there a few times, and I don't know all the resource issues on that border area. But certainly, it is it's a tense place.
Yeah.
I have been down there half a dozen times. We've done things building homes, and it's frightening. It's frightening. It's gotten a little bit better, but I lived in California for a while, and we'd have projects down there, and we watched the situation carefully, and you're not so sure about the law enforcement situation as one that you can trust, and so there may be better approaches to this, and better resourced groups, and perhaps our military who can step in and fill the gap.
Jay, you and I have to take our final break. We'll be back in a couple of minutes, but I do want to thank you so much for coming on. Congratulations on your book. And
thank you.
It's been a great hour so far. Exonation, Jay Milbrandt is our guest this hour. www.jaymilbrandt.com. That's JAYMILBRANT.com. He's on Facebook at facebook.com/Jay Milbrandt, and you can follow him on Twitter at Jay Milbrandt. He's the author of The Daring Heart of David Livingstone, Exile, African Slavery, and the Publicity Stunt that Saved Millions. And we'll be back on the other side of this commercial break as we wrap up this hour here in the X-Zone from our broadcast center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Don't forget, you can always listen to the X-Zone 24/7, 365 at www.xzoneradiotv.com or by your phone, 213-401-0080. Jay and I will be back on the other side of this break. Don't go away. Welcome back, everyone. This is the X-Zone. I am Rob McConnell. We're coming to you from our center in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Jay Milbrandt is my special guest this hour. His website is www.jaymilbrandt.com. That's jaymilbrandt.com. On Facebook, facebook.com/Jay Milbrandt. And you can follow Jay on Twitter at Jay Milbrandt. Jay is the author of The Daring Heart of David Livingstone, Exile, African Slavery, and the Publicity Stunt that Saved Millions. First of all, Jay, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been a great hour with you. What was it that finally brought the slave trade to an end?
Well, ultimately, it was the will of the people. Livingstone had advocated for the end of the slave trade. His letters eventually encouraged the nation to speak up about it, to rise up and really force the British government to intervene. And the British government sent down ships to blockade the harbors where the slave traders were sending their slaves out, and then they would empty the ships and burn them. They found them. Then the British government went on land and actually took the fight to the dens of the slavers, where they were and arrest those who were enslaving people and bring them to justice publicly. So it was a lot of people involved, but it was really the advocacy of a nation that brought it about.
How much would a slave cost back then?
Pennies. I mean, it was Livingstone would cite some of the amounts that were paid in the market, and it would be pennies or dollars for someone, especially a child. It was almost nothing. I mean, they were one of the lowest priced commodities of the day.
What do you think Livingstone would say today with the slave trade that is still in play?
Well, I think he'd certainly be concerned about it, and that he would feel, much as he said that in the day he called it the open sore of the world, and I think he would still see this as the open sore of the world that needs healing. I think he would want to encourage the enforcement of laws around the world, and that the slave trade should be ended, and that it could be ended. And I think his story is a modern analog for what we see today, and that the same principles of justice and how he advocated and created justice systems for these things to be eradicated are modernly relevant.
You know, Jay, it almost seems that we do more to protect endangered species of animals than we do to protect certain areas where people are concerned that are being taken and trafficked around the world for slavery.
Well, there's certainly a lot of things to be concerned about, whether it's the environment or animal rights, but this is one that human trafficking and modern-day slavery, an issue that needs more attention, needs more resources. And, you know, we put a lot of resources as a government, the United States government puts a lot of resources into providing food aid, aid of various kinds to around the world. And we don't put historically much financial resource into justice system.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's one thing that we're missing. And whether it's police enforcement or law, courts of law.
Jay, we've got to say so long for tonight, but I want to thank you so much for joining us. Continued success. I love what you're doing, and I'd love to have you back on in the future. Take care of yourself, Jay.
Thanks, Rob. Appreciate it.
We'll be back on the other side of this break. X-Zone Nation, don't go away.